Hi guys. Okay, I'm going to show you two ways to finish off your hat or to bind it off and take it off the loom. This first way I like to use for fingering weight yarn, sock weight yarn, worsted weight yarn, and not for bulky weight yarn. If you're making a hat with bulky weight yarn, then I'll show you that technique next. So what we're going to do is, work your hat till it's as long as you want, and take your yarn and wrap it around your loom twice. 1, 2, and then give yourself an extra maybe 6 to 10 inches just for working room and give it a cut. I love these little travel scissors. These are super sharp and absolutely perfect. Take them on the plane. Never had any trouble. Okay, now thread it onto a needle. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. This is our last stitch here. So I'm going to take this yarn and thread it behind the next 2 pegs. Oops. Okay. So you can see here the yarn is going behind these 2 pegs. And then what I'm going to do is this is the next loop. I'm going to bring the needle down through that loop. This is where you just got to be careful not to catch your yarn on any of the pegs. Make sure it really stays behind these 2 pegs. So I'm going down through that loop, so that's the 3rd peg, and then up into the loop on the 4th peg. Okay, then I go behind these next 2 pegs and then bring the yarn down through the loop on the 6th peg. Is that right? So we've gone behind these 2 pegs, we're threading the yarn through these 2 pegs, behind these 2 pegs, and then threading the yarn through these 2 pegs. And that's all we're going to do for the first round. Go behind 2 and then go in front and thread the needle through the 2 loops. Okay, now we're back to where we started. I've threaded through these 2 loops. So we started off going just behind these 2 pegs and threading through these 2. So on the second round, basically we're going to want to thread through the ones that we didn't thread through on the first round. So we're going to go down into this first peg, up into the second peg, and then we're going to go behind these next 2 ones because we already threaded through those on the first round. So you're just doing the same thing that you did in the first round, but you're doing the opposite pegs. So continue doing that all the way around. Okay, so now everything's been sewn through. So we can take our yarn needle off. And we're just going to use our hook tool and just pluck it all off the loom. You could also do this as you go, but sometimes that can just make things more confusing if it's the first time you're doing this. Okay, got it off the loom. Now we want to make sure that we turn our hat inside out. Find that yarn end. There we go. Okay, hat's inside out. And you can just start tugging on that yarn and it will start to pull your hat together. You could put your finger in the middle to try and keep it even. And it just keeps pulling. Okay. So what it's done here, you can see how this has evened out. Because we've alternated which ones we've threaded through, it kind of almost creates a bit of a spiral. It's sort of a two-layer kind of spiral, so that when you pull it tight, you've got stitches that are laying on top and then stitches that are laying underneath, and it actually just naturally creates this really nice pattern. So some of the looms will come with instructions that say just thread through every peg and then pull it tight, but sometimes, especially with worsted weight yarn, you can end up with just a hole at the top of your hat because you can't really pull it tight enough to get it closed all the way. So this is a really nice way to deal with anything worsted weight or lighter. Once you finish knitting your hat on your loom, you're just going to do a basic bind off, take it off the loom, and you'll be left with a tube, basically. Because your yarn is so bulky, we need to sew it up in a very specific way to give it a good shape at the top. You can use your bulky yarn for this or sewing thread, depending on how strong your yarn is. You really want to make sure that when you're sewing it up, that you actually have the hat turned inside out. So we're working on the inside of the hat. What we're going to do is we're going to sew it together up in the middle, and it's going to be a series of this together and then bringing these corners in and gradually bringing more corners in. So what you're going to want to do is and that's because the way we're going to do it, we're going to do it this way because this yarn is so bulky and because this hat is so sort of bulky and thick. If you had maybe a thinner yarn, you could get away with just kind of working around the edge and cinching it tight. But with this yarn, if you do it that way, you're never really going to get it cinched all together. You're never going to get all the stitches scrunched together. It's going to be like a little ponytail hole in the top, which is fine if that's what you're going for. That's definitely the way to do it. Okay, so I'm just going to start where the seam is, which gives me a good opposite starting point. And you can also sort of work all this out in advance and put stitch markers exactly where you want to seam these together. So this doesn't need to be a bunch of sewing, but I'm just going to give like 3 stitches here. And I actually want a little bit more of the tail here to work with. Okay, now notice how my yarn is on the left side. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the right hand side in here, find that middle point, bring it in, and this doesn't need to be an exact science. And then we're going to cross this yarn over here and stitch it just a little sort of diagonally. So we're stitching from the center point out to this left hand side. And I've got my yarn tail stuck in there. There we go. Okay, so we're starting to see it cross, and then we're going to come back to the center point and stitch it to the right hand side. Okay, now we're going to work this side, so let's flip it around. go here, and we want it to cross again, so we're going to go, so this yarn's on the left, so we're going to start working to the right side. Okay, and back again and work it on the left side. Okay, and what you can do is just have a look at how that's looking on your hat from the outside. So you've got this sort of cross stitches in here. And depending on how bulky your yarn is, you could, and sort of what you want, you could just, again, turn it back inside out and just seam these along this seam. But looking at it, you know, it's going to look like that, and it's going to be a bit squarey. So we're going to pull these tips in again, just to round it off a little bit. So I'll turn it back inside out. Okay, so we've got these 4 little loops, and our yarn is here. So I'm going to work on, just going to work on this loop, and I'm going to fold it in half and pull it in. And again, work it left side and then work it right side. And then what I'm going to do here is actually just sew these 2 guys up a little bit, not together, but just sew them individually, just so that the hat doesn't have any holes in. So we're just going to put a little stitch in there. And I'm just going to stick my finger through there, make sure that's closed. Yep, it's all closed. Doesn't take much because this yarn's so bulky. It just takes 1 little stitch to close it off. And then I'm going to bring my yarn back over to this side to work this guy. Just going to kind of weave it through there to get it in the right spot. Okay, so let's give this guy a little stitch. Okay, and then we can have a look. Let's see, stick my finger through there, and that's pretty closed. And we can turn this inside out and then see how we're doing. So you've got the 4 that haven't been, or the 3 that haven't been done, and then you've got this little guy. So that looks a little bit better. It's a little bit less boxy. And it kind of pleats in your hat. So that's it. So you're just going to do this in all of your corners. Okay, so here we have it. Now I've turned this right side out, and I popped it on my head to round it out, pop it out, and it's pretty even. It's not exactly, like, it doesn't have to be perfect, but It's better than having a square top.